Shalom Aleichem, and welcome back to Shtark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. For the next 6 weeks, from now until Shavuos, we will be having 2 weekly episodes. On Mondays, we will be continuing our original format of conversations with role models and mentors. And on Thursdays, we will be learning topics from Pirkei Avos. There are so many Mishnayos in this Pak Masechta that go to the very heart of what it means to be a Ben Torah in the workforce. For example, should a person love their job? Is working to make a living lechatchila or b'diavad, and more. I will be fleshing out these ideas with my friend Tzvi Goldstein, a writer, teacher, and editor who's doing a lot of important work writing about Hashkafic topics. Today, we'll be doing an introduction to this series about the role of Hashkafa and Pirkei Avos in our lives. It was an honor to sit down to discuss these very big questions with Reuven Taragin.
Reuven Taragin wears many hats. I'll try to cover some of them, most of them. Reuven Taragin is the Dean of Overseas Students at Yeshivat HaKotel. He's the Director of Education together with his wife Shani at Mizrahi. Reuven Taragin is also the Rosh Beit Midrash in the summer at Mosheva Ayo. Reuven Taragin has been involved in coordinating, really starting a number of different unity initiatives, such as the Bayichan program and the Achenu Worldwide Unity Initiative. Reuven Taragin also has been publishing in a number of different formats, essays in Hashkafa and contemporary Jewish issues, both through Mizrahi and a number of newspapers. And most recently, Reuven Taragin has published a sefer through Mosaic Press, Essentials of Judaism, a Hashkafic primer, which we are going to discuss more over the course of this podcast.
This series is sponsored Le'ilui Nishmas Mai Amama, Hen Yerila Bas Eliezer, whose yahrzeit is coming up soon. I was zocha to have a wonderful relationship with Amama, visiting her with my siblings almost every Sunday of my childhood. So just to review, this is the intro to our series on Pirkei Avos, which will be coming out every Thursday from now until Shavuos. And the classic Shtark Tank format will continue on Mondays, so stay tuned for that. Alongside Tzvi Goldstein, my name is Yaakov Wolf, and this is Shtark Tank. So we've entered the period of the year, Yiras HaOmer, where Klal Yisrael renews our focus on the wonderful sefer of Pirkei Avos, the wonderful Mishnayos, full of beautiful ideas that are very relevant to our times. And so this year, particularly on the Shtark Tank podcast, we will be learning Pirkei Avos every week, topics related to what it means to work and be a Ben Torah in the workforce. But far more importantly and more significantly for Klal Yisrael is that we have a beautiful new sefer, The Essentials of Judaism, a Hashkafic primer by Rabbi Reuven Taragin. And it's an honor to have Rabbi Taragin here to discuss Pirkei Avos and Hashkafa and what that means to us today. So thank you so much for joining us today, Rabbi Taragin.
Great to be with you, Yaakov, Tzvi, and you should call for your podcast. The Chinuch famously explains that Sfirat HaOmer is a way of showing how important Torah is. That leaving Mitzrayim is not complete until we get to Matan Torah. Okay, that's of course correct. But there's a second aspect of Sfirat HaOmer which you assumed in your words, which we need to emphasize. The Medrash writes that the Jewish people deserve to receive the Torah right away, but they weren't able because they had just come out of slavery. The Medrash describes it as they are full of bricks and mortar. They're not in a state where they're ready, even though they deserve to receive the Torah. And that Hashem took them through the desert for a period of 50 days in order to make them ready. This means that you see already then for the first generation, those 50 days were a stage for them to prepare themselves, to make themselves people who were bar Kabbalah of the Torah. I want to share with you a beautiful way Rav Moshe Weinberger applies this to recent history. He talks about how when he was a young child, he would look at family albums of relatives right after the Holocaust, and he saw that many of the men weren't wearing yarmulkes, the women weren't dressed appropriately. And he asked his parents, who were Holocaust survivors, what's pshat? They said, you have to understand what the state of concentration camp survivors was. They were in a different place. Rav Weinberger said they weren't yet ready to fully be Makabel Torah. It's just important to have that historical perspective. Baruch Hashem, we're living generations later. We're more ready. We have to use this period to rebuild ourselves, to redevelop our perspective on life to be more ready. And that brings us to Pirkei Avot. People know Pirkei Avot as a sechet that deals with midos. and personal growth, which it definitely does. There's also a very significant portion of hashkafa there. And I think part of the reason why, like you see in the Rambam, like you see in the Ramchal, like you see in others, midos should be rooted in our hashkafa, in our perspective. So the Sefer is very much a combination of both. That was just a little background before we get to your question you wanted to ask.
Great. So you already talked a little bit about what hashkafa is, and you also mentioned the fact that the generations are constantly shifting and there are constantly new challenges that we're facing. So can you define what it is that people are so interested in when it comes to hashkafa, specifically in today's generation?
Right. So the word hashkafa means outlook, and I think it's focused on today because not specifically today, but over the past few centuries, people have been much more focused on their own existence and their responsibilities and goals. Just to contrast this, Jewish philosophy, mahashava, in the times of the Rishonim, was much more focused on studying the world of God. The Rambam, with his physics and metaphysics, first Prakim of Yesodei Torah, where he talks about the nature of our world and the world above, or the Kabbalists who were talking about Sfirot, understanding the spheres of influence through which God influences our world. But over the past few centuries, the focus is much more on what's my mission in life? What are my responsibilities? An excellent example of this transition is the Ramchal, I mentioned before, who starts in a similar way to the Rambam. He's clearly paraphrasing, building off the model of the Rambam, but he defines in his introduction that his sefer, that the goal in life should be to understand our responsibilities and our goals. And it's interesting, by the way, that he talks about both responsibilities and goals. And whether you're in the world of Kabbalah, where that translates into Chassidus, the difference between Chassidus and Kabbalah being Chassidus is focused on what these things mean in our world. Or you're a rationalist, take, for example, Rosh Soloveitchik, whose titles are it's existentialism. People are much more focused on what is the nature and purpose of my existence. And the truth is, if you look back at Tanakh and Chazal, I think they were much more focused on that too. So it's not like some newfangled idea that suddenly 300 years ago people started thinking about themselves. I think Tanakh and Chazal are much more about that, much less about metaphysics and Kabbalah. You do have it there, but it's less about what they wrote about. So to a large extent, our world's return to existentialism, and Avos is definitely in that category, and speaking much more about our existence.
Point that Rav Hirsch, I think, makes Rav Hirsch likes to make often, is that the word Torah itself is milashon hara. The Torah is supposed to be a guide. It's a lot easier to see how Torah can serve as a guide from this existentialist perspective. It's harder to see that. Let's say it's hard to see that the broader goal would be the physics and the metaphysics. As much as it's there, it would seem to be the main goal.
I agree with you, Tzvi. I would just say the Rambam would probably respond by saying that he believes that Deos, the building of our midos, not only our beliefs, should be based on emulating God. So the more you understand God and his world, the more you can translate that, but it's much less direct. In fact, Rav Tzvi, the idea you quoted from Rav Hirsch, I would take back to something we just read a couple of days ago on Achron Shel Pesach, when Hashem wants to start teaching the Jews about the significance of Torah, the weight, the impact of Torah. They get tomorrow, they don't have water. He waits for them to complain in order to provide. And of course, the Sham Sam L'Chok Mishpat, the first time that they only giving over mitzvos, he gave them all the good base. And he says, if you listen to my voice, then you won't get sick. But what's interesting is that the Torah uses a very interesting word to describe the wood that God shows Moshe to heal the water. Vayureu Hashem eitz. And I think the word Vayureu is used because it's a forerunner of the word Torah. God is showing Moshe what to use. Torah is correct. It says Lashon Hora, Moret. And so it should be giving us direction for our lives and not just exposing us to worlds above.
So Rebbe has the Sefer going through fundamentals of Hashkafa through Pirkei Avos. So I'm curious which one came first, kind of the chicken or the egg. Did Rebbe set out to write a Sefer on fundamentals of Hashkafa and then use Avos as the frame for that? Or did Rebbe want to write a Sefer on Avos and chose to present it through this lens of fundamentals of Hashkafa?
I think this is going to disappoint you, but with both. Very much both at the same time. Meaning, I think Avot is important to learn because obviously we have a custom to learn Pirkei Avot in this period. You don't need me to tell you. And as far as I understand, Avot is one of the most written on svarim of Judaism, the Haggadah and Avot. It makes sense because it's a period when we're meant to learn it. and because of the significance of the Mishnayot there. But also, I wanted to write something that would give people basics of what they need, guidance in life. And so it was really both at the same time. And I think area of hashkafa is something that they're written about enough. I don't mean as a sikha here and there, but in an organized way to go through topic by topic in logical order. It's not written enough. There are things, but not written on enough. So yeah, it was very much both.
Does Rebbe feel that Avos was written kind of explicitly to be this guide to hashkafa? And if yes, why wouldn't Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi have organized in the way Rebbe did?
Okay, well, first of all, why I chose Avot. Avot is the earliest / best repository of hashkafic material. Meaning, obviously, you have a lot of hashkafa and chazal, but it's scattered around, the Gemara's discussion in the Midrashim. Avos is Mishnayot, very much focused, and Tanakh also has hashkafa in it, but it's not presented that way. And of course, again, like the Gemara is scattered around. Is Avot meant to be hashkafa sake? So first of all, there's a lot in Avot that's not what we would call hashkafa, so it's not purely hashkafa. Avot has hashkafa, very significant amount. It has a presentation of midot, also guidance, practical guidance for life, like for judges. Krishna was about that, and how that applies to us as well. The question you asked about how Rebbe wrote things is a question about Avot and in general. I think people are frustrated sometimes, people who are used to thinking topically, when you read Mishnayot that are clearly not topical. What I mean by that is the Ein Bains. The string of Ein Bain Mishnayot go run from topic to topic. They're not particularly connected to each other, and each one is its own new world. And we have that in many examples of the Gemara, all the more so. Even within a topic, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi doesn't start by introducing the basic background of the topic and the psukim and the definitions. He'll pop right in the middle of the topic. Emusai Koran Shema B'Arvin. What's Shema? Where does it come from? Tanakh Ekoi. Right? So, they have the Kahati Mishnayos. That gives you the background information, and then you get to the Mishnah. So, why didn't Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi write it Kahati style? The answer is, I think, twofold. Number one, Yehuda Hanassi was interested in collecting and organizing, presenting the Torah Shemal Peh. Not like the Rambam who presents the whole background, the Torah Shemal, the Torah Shemal Peh. He's presenting the statements of the Tanoim on this topic. And number two, something important for us to remember, Torah Shemal Peh was Baal Peh. It seems even Rebbe didn't write down the Mishnayos, right? He just collected the Mishnayot. A key part was the ability to remember it. And a lot of the aspects of how the Mishnayot are collected is to help with memory. Now, we don't have those issues today, so we're not sensitive enough to it. A third issue that's particularly relevant in Avot is, especially in the first parak, but not only, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is tracking historical Masorah of Torah Shemal Peh. So as soon as you're going historically, you don't necessarily have hashkafic flow, though there is hashkafic flow within the history. I'll just mention first two prakim are historical. The middle of the first parak moves from the historical Masorah to the actual biological Masorah of Hillel and his descendants. We come back to the historical Masorah in the middle of the second parak. And if you look at the fifth parak, that's a classic Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi associative structure, in the sense that you have lists of tens and then lists of sevens, 5, 3. So that's clearly arranged by number, although I think there are connections within the lists of numbers too. So just to get back to what we were talking about, Pirkei Avot is the most central collection of hashkafic material. Not that all hashkafic topics are discussed. There are many hashkafic topics talked about there, which is interesting. Why and why not? And what the Torah talk about and what more there is to speak about. But if we're looking within Divrei Chazal, Pirkei Avos is the best place we can find collection-wise, and it's something we're meant to learn during a period of time within the year. So it makes sense to use it as a launching pad for organizing our hashkafa. There are topics, as I mentioned, not mentioned there, and as Rav Tzvi knows, we started writing on those topics as well, so hopefully we'll be able to address other topics as well. I'll just mention one additional point, which is, we're talking a little bit of what's written and what's not written about hashkafa. So I think you have three types of works out there that I'm familiar with. One is sichot. People have their sichot on Parashat Shavua, whatever it is, and obviously hashkafa comes up, but it's not organized by topic. A second type of work you have is where a person wrote on a particular hashkafic topic. There's a sefer on A, on B, on C. There's very little written trying to cover hashkafa as a whole. There are some things. For example, I want to mention Rav Wiederblank, for those who are familiar with him. He has a very comprehensive sefer, a series of Sfarim he's writing. Not purely hashkafa, it's machshava and hashkafa mixed in. And that's, written comprehensively. It's a very serious deep dive. My goal is to present the ideas in a bite-sized way, comprehensive, but bite-sized, and more in the full. It's not going through the machloks and rishonim, etc., analyzing different opinions, but trying to present the derech hamelech as a central approach that can help us know hashkafa. And the book is in a way that each piece is about 5 pages. You can sit down in 5-10 minutes and really, be corner something. And there's about 50 pieces in it. There are 50 pieces in it. About the 50 days of year is over, so a person can learn each day one of these pieces and really cover the basic hashkafa above all.
You talked about the Mesorah that is the opening and the framework that Pirkei Avos uses, and our whole religion, as you talk about in the Hakdama of the book, is really built on this strong sense of tradition. But one of the things that I struggle with is that when we talk about all these very modern issues like making career decisions and work-life balance and things that seem very, very different, we're struggling with very, very different challenges than what people have struggled with in the past. So how do we develop a hashkafa on those very modern issues that is really steeped in tradition?
So, obviously this is a very important question. It's the $1 million question. I think people make a mistake in thinking that because we live in a different world with different questions, therefore our Mesorah doesn't relate to it. So obviously the situation's changed, but the guidelines don't necessarily change. And you mentioned the particular example of how to choose a profession. Chazal do relate to how to choose a profession. And I think a lot of what they say is very relevant in today's world as well. For example, there's a mission at the end of Kiddushin, which talks about, the advantages and disadvantages of different professions. Taking a step back to Avot, there's general guidelines, which are very, very important for everything in life, including profession. For example, the mission in the second parak, which says, Aseh ritzoncha, make his will your will, right? Which is saying that a person should be aiming not to fulfill their own ambitions, but to fulfill what God expects from them, which, by the way, is ultimately your true ambitions, even though you don't realize it, right? So that isn't telling you whether to be a doctor or a lawyer, but it's definitely giving you the guidelines of how you should be thinking. And, moving past Avot, one of the things I do in the Sefer is, so we start with Avot, but extend beyond in Chazal, etc. There's a Gemara in Brachos Daf Mem Gimel, which doesn't come to the issue from the question of how to choose a profession, but says something that has a lot of impact. Gemara there says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates people liking the area of work they're meant to go into. Where there says that Hashem creates pigs to like mud because they're meant to spend their time in the mud. Or in other words, a person should ask themselves, what do I have an inclination to? And if a person understands that's min hashamayim, the direction they're getting, then they're making a decision min hashamayim. Meaning, two people could choose to enter a profession, but for very different reasons. One is entering it because they're trying to fulfill God's will, which they determined by looking at how they were created. The other person is choosing it because this is what they're interested in, what they feel that will be self-fulfilling for them. So again, Chazal don't relate to lawyer, doctor, or accountant, right? But Chazal give you guidelines, both about professions in general, about life in general, and about one's own personal inclinations that are very significant. So just as far as the particular question and other questions like it, there's a lot within our Mesorah that gives us guidelines. Obviously, we have to know how do we apply that Bisman Hazeh, and I'll just give you an example of that. Rav Lopiansky has a whole sikha where he talks about, the advantage of entering into a federal job, and a person gains from that, the advantages, disadvantages. That's an example of a person taking the Torah's hashkafa and trying to apply it to our situation today. So, this brings us to the fact that, part of what Avos teaches us is that we rely on our historical Mesorah, and also those who are the continued bearers of that Mesorah, to help translate what we know from the past into the present.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that there are any ideas based on Chazal and the Mesorah that people don't necessarily emphasize enough, either when choosing a profession or making career decisions within their career, things that people either miss or just don't put enough weight on that you see outside?
For sure. So one example, what I just gave about how we make decisions. I think many people grew up in a world where Judaism is seen as a tax write-off. What I mean by that is essentially my life is my life. I'm living my life. And there's X amount I need to give to God. That X amount could be 5%, 10%, your big machmir, 15%, 20%, 25%. But essentially, Judaism is a part of your mafresh. And then, you keep the laws and you avoid the restrictions and you do the mitzvot, and then basically you live life like everybody else. That, of course, is a very big mistake. We need to start with the things discussed in Avos about the purpose of the world, about our place within the world, about what our mission should be, and thus, how we should live our lives, how we should use our time. And that's an excellent example of where the fact that hashkafa isn't really studied well leaves people, at a blank with it. Obviously, the more well-known things for people who work in an area that allows them to learn Torah and then to do other things and to have a family life. So those things are important too. But I think the core basic pre-assumptions are sometimes missing from people.
Just to follow up on this, does everything that if people kind of took this broader hashkafic perspective when making these choices, are there certain professions or area things would be more or less out of line or would be more prioritized than they usually are now, specifically using this hashkafic background to make those decisions?
I think there's two things people, need to think about when they look at professions. The first is what they're going to do in their profession. And the second is what will be with the rest of their life values and goals. So, for example, a lot of people point out people in finance. So there could be people in finance who are helping the world run and helping companies function. And then there could be people in finance who are gutting companies, who are day traders. If I'm understanding correctly, we're just making money off the fluctuations up and down. So that isn't particularly, as far as I understand, contributing. And it's similar to what Chazal spoke about in Sanhedrin, about the person who's not being Torah to Yeshuva Shalom. So there's another example of how Chazal related to what a person should aim to be doing in their work. Chazal didn't call it a profession, illness, right? Illness. And the second question is making sure that the rest of your life, you have a life beyond your illness. The exact balance between how much your life is different for different people. Obviously, there are certain types of umnios that are going to require a tremendous focus, and they're very important. Umnios, that need to be done. So the answer isn't the same for everyone, but I think those are the two, parameters to consider.
You can almost focus on one to the exclusion of the other, but that's not going to necessarily leave you in the best place. To only think about your life outside of the profession would lead you to selling doorknobs on Amazon. Whereas how much is that contributing to Yeshuva Shalom? Whereas if you only consider the benefits of the profession and you don't think about the time outside, what's going to be with your Talmud Torah, what's going to be with your family. So you really have to figure out how can you best balance both sides of that.
That different people may have more of a focus on one versus the other. And just to be fair to those selling doorknobs on Amazon, if a person is selling doorknobs so that people can have functioning doors, that's part of Yeshuva Shalom. And the point I'm making is, because of the way communications has expanded today, you can be involved in a relatively small thing that can have a major impact. Meaning, once upon a time, everything was purchased within the town. So you really needed a doorknob specialist within a town of, 500 people. So what's wrong with you? But in a world where you're selling to millions of people, so one person sells doorknobs. Actually, one person sells doorknobs with this kind of lock. The other person sells doorknobs with that kind of lock. And if you're particularly handling the market of doorknobs with this kind of lock, that's your contribution. You don't have to be the one building the house or the one planting the field. That's a different thing in the world today, which actually is more efficient. When we talk about the world moving forward in a positive way, it helps things function better and gives people the ability to focus on something well.
I didn't mean to insult the people selling doorknobs on Amazon. But it calls to mind that we can
realize how small things can make a bigger impact.
Absolutely. Just something that Rebbe said out also earlier called to mind. Rav Dessler's two grocers, his two salesmen, where you have two people operating basically the same store. One is his mindset is I'm looking to give, I'm looking to feed the town and make sure that they have food to eat, and the other was looking to take. How can I get the money? They're both doing the same thing. But their mindsets are in such different places. I think it's a similar two potential perspectives.
As far as mindset, people sometimes underestimate how significant mindset is. And there's a number of Mishnayos and Pirkei Avos which speak about what a person's intention is beyond the Aseh Ritzon Olam that we mentioned. Chol Ma'asecha Yihu L'Shem Shamayim. So it's an excellent example of how it's not just what you do, it's why you do it. Rahman Liba Boy, which Avos and Chazal in general put a big emphasis on.
I'll tell you kind of a lot about where your perspective is there. So I'm curious for Rebbe personally, Rebbe wrote the Sefer and Pirkei Avos and these fundamentals of Hashkafa and the significance of the Balei and Torah. I'm curious who Rebbe's personal Avos are, both in terms of family, in terms of Rebbeim, and how they impacted this Sefer specifically, and kind of Rebbe's perspective, Rebbe's Hashkafa more broadly. And I think Rebbe wrote the introduction about his grandfather. Rebbe can maybe talk about that as well.
So in your question, you speak about two kinds of Avos. My family Avos and my Rebbeim Avos, and I think that your question is well presented because we need to look at both. A big part of Judaism is relating to one's own Avot, seeing oneself as a continuation of one's family, and aiming to be a good continuation. Right? The famous measure, a person should always ask themselves, when will my actions reach the level of Maaseh Avosai? You should want to live up to what your tradition is and hopefully exceed it, hopefully even add to Maaseh Avosav. That's an important thing. Doesn't mean that if a person's own avos are weaker, they should only sell themselves short, but you begin. It's a starting point. My grandfather learned in Shiva in Europe as a young boy and then was forced to go to America right after World War I alone as a teenager. These things are unimaginable today and work, starting on the base level and send most of the money home to bring his family over. And, the amazing thing about he and his family we brought over is that they all remained religious, strongly religious, and were leaders in their community religiously. And were people who, in addition to working, definitely people who were Anshe Elma, Anshe Derech Eretz, very strong connection to Torah, not just in observing mitzvot, but Divrei Torah, Shem Shemaim Shagra B'Fiyam. So, a model of people who worked, but were very much involved in Torah. And going back a few generations before that, many generations of Rabbanim, going back to the Vilna Gaon's brother, a very famous family, the Sirius Nefesh, the Wolf family. Actually, I don't think it's really connected to your Wolf, but yeah. And so they have the family Avos on my mother's side. So my grandfather on my mother's side, was one who went to yeshiva, came over to America, was told he needed to shave his beard, shave his face, and of course, he didn't. And was a Rav in Baltimore at a time where people were not ready for values in the full sense of the word, but he very much held the line, and so the rest of the society there came around. It's interesting that those are the people who built American Jewry, those who did not budge, and eventually the rest of the world around them came back. It's interesting to note, as far as I understand, there's a shul in Borough Park called Shomrei Shabbos. Similar shuls in other places, and you wonder why someone would name their shul Shomrei Shabbos. Did you call your shul Lovshei Tefillin? I'm saying, what kind of name is that? And so it seems, again, I don't know historically, if I'm wrong, then correct me, that the shul was founded at a time when many religious Jews were not Shomrei Shabbos. Choice, whatever, as far as getting a job. They say that a lot of the Hashkamim and Yonim in America were started by people who needed to daven early to go to work. So maybe this was a shul of people who were proud that they were Shomrei Shabbos. That's just a reminder of what a different generation was. And those were the people who really held the line in a way that people could return to it and know what it meant to be a proper Jew. Spiritually, as far as spiritual level, each of us need both. And you need spiritual level because these are people you choose to identify with, and they can hopefully reinforce, the values of where you come from. I was very lucky, privileged, to have a series of 5 Rebbeim starting in 11th grade, really an all-star team. Meir Twersky, Mordechai Willig, Rav Mendel Blachman, Aaron Lichtenstein, and Rav Michael Rosenzweig. I don't know if people can say that today. It was 5 years running. Those were 5 years. So, okay, anything I am today, it's kind of unfair. The opportunity I was given. And again, everything in life, you have to look at the opportunity given and the responsibility you have because of that. Each one of those Rabbanim, they're from a very similar world, as far as, within the Orthodox world, but so different. So each of them is so different. And I think that's something you gain from when you're exposed to Rebbeim who are different, because it forces you to figure out what your place is, because you can't merely imitate the Rebbeim you have because they're so different. Both they one another different from you, but each of them obviously very strong values and strong commitment to values. And so, those 5 Rabbanim are really people who started me off on my path, and still B'kesher with them. Rav Lichtenstein obviously passed away, but B'kesher with the other 4, some more than others. I would say that 2 of those 4 I'm most B'kesher with would be Rav Lachman and Rav Willig, just because of the nature of their interactions with people. But those were Rosenzweig and Ruth Trotsky as well. And Baruch Hashem, I think this is an important point. I've been able to learn from additional people beyond. And again, that's one of the big advantages of communications today. You can learn from people you don't necessarily sit in the classroom with. And over the years, I've had the chance of interacting closely with a lot of other Gedolei Yisrael and Avot. I'm very close to Yecheskel Weinfeld, and I interact with Rav Reisman from Brooklyn, and Rav Lopiansky, who I mentioned before. There's even a Chabad Rosh Hashiva in New Haven, Rav Collinson, who I've interacted with from a distance. And that is many, many people. If you're learning and you're reading, there's many, many people who you can be exposed to, even if they're not your central Rebbe. So, for example, over Pesach, I was preparing shiurim for the 6th parak of Brachos. I've read writings from tens of different Rosh Yeshiva and authors, on it. And so that's a great chus we have today because of the availability of, material and people. So, the next question is going to be, well, I have all these different people, so do you have any? I think people have their initial guides who help you set your path. And then if you have your path set in a clear way, it's easy to continue learning from people. And maybe I'll just elaborate a minute. What does it mean to have your path set in a clear way? So, most people, when they're young, they set a certain path and then they continue with it. I think it's important that the path be in a clear and correct way. And I'll explain what I mean. The biggest challenge, as was mentioned before, is how do we navigate, our tradition in a modern world? Obviously, everyone is impacted by the world around us. No one is like our great-great-great-grandparents, as we shouldn't be. And we continue growing in the world around us, etc. But how do we know what we can and should take from the world around us and what we shouldn't? So I think there's 2 very important guidelines here. One is understanding that our values are meant to come from the Torah, from the inside. We take Chachma from the Goyim, but not Torah. We said before, using that medrash and what Tzvi said about Torah, right? Chachma versus Torah. And that distinction is very often blurred. And when it's blurred, we get ourselves into a lot of trouble. Number 2 is to make sure that we approach Torah looking to be impacted and with a genuine open-mindedness to be driven by the Torah, as opposed to, as strange as it will sound, looking to fit the Torah into our preconceived notions. So many people who've grown up in the modern secular world come to the Torah with their pre-assumptions, and they often don't even realize that they're just fitting the Torah in. And that's a very sad thing to see, especially when it impacts other people. Well, that was the first point. The second point is, as Rav Kook writes and Rav Lichtenstein wrote, and they really all the ability were right. It's critical to make sure that the path and the perspective you have is a path and perspective that there are at least one or some or one Gadol B'Torah who has as well. This is a very important thing, and again, it's an area where people are not always careful and where we get into a lot of trouble in. So if a person understands the difference between Torah and Chachma, and has developed themselves in a way that there's a genuine commitment, submission to Torah and its values. So there could be different paths within that a person gains when they're young. Then you're coming to Torah to learn and be guided, as opposed to coming to Torah to look for your agenda.
I want to follow up with a question about the wide array of Rabbanim who you're in touch with. You're obviously involved in a lot of very important Achdus initiatives. The Vayichan program, we're coming up, Bezrat Hashem, on Kabbalah Satorah, where we focus on the Achdus of Klal Yisrael. And to me, Achdus should have 2 components. Number 1 is to not make a machlokes where there's no need to be a machlokes. But on the other hand, there could be a machlokes and we can still love each other and be connected and be respectful of each other. And I'm wondering, it seems when it comes to the world of work and employment and careers, that there are very different approaches among different Torah communities. And so do you think that this is an area where we just have a machlokas and we have to be respectful of other ways? Or is it really just less of a machlokas than people make it out to be?
First of all, speaking about the principle of machlokas and achdus, machlokas is built in and meant to exist within Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? The HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah in a way that there are different perspectives, intending for the different perspectives to be fleshed out, and they're fleshed out through machlokas. So machlokas is a natural, intended part of Limud Torah. The word machlokas is used to refer to a debate and used to refer to a fight. And the first one is healthy, the second one is problematic. Right? Sources in Chazal about how things were done to avoid machlokas. So what do you mean? Meaning, when you say to avoid machlokas, they mean to avoid fighting. And, achdus should be rooted in three things. First of all, in understanding that we have goals we need to work on together. That's utilitarian achdus. Number two, it's a realization that we're all the same team. We're all banim Hashem Elokechem. We're all brothers. And therefore, even if we disagree with each other, ultimately we're family. The ideal level of achdus is where people come to appreciate that we're all aiming l'shem shamayim. We're brought together by the same values, at a value-led achdus. And frankly, at least within Torah Jews, that should be possible. And that's what Vayichad and other things like it are based upon. It's unfortunate that that's sometimes, I think, lost. Now again, to be fair, there are many people who speak in the name of the Torah who are outside the pale of Torah Jewry. So everyone agrees that there are things that are outside the pale, and different people draw those lines in different places. Every once in a while you hear others, that they don't care about achdus because they're not including this so-and-so. The response is, you yourself wouldn't include a different so-and-so further away. So I would agree the line needs to be drawn. You can't criticize someone because they're drawing the line in a different place. So seek as much as possible to broaden the breadth of the Torah community and to bring people together. Because as you said, Rabbi Yaakov, the differences are overemphasized as opposed to the similarities. And we're stronger as a community when we can emphasize the similarities despite the differences, and there are genuine, significant differences, and that's okay. And it's meant to be that way because each Jew is created differently to have a different balance. And so, many Jews who have a similar place of balance, come together and they have this group and that group, and that's mine. One of the questions I'm sure Tzvi thinks about a lot is, to what extent are each one of us genuinely who we're meant to be, or just how we happen to have been raised? I'm talking about Tzvi's recent piece, where he talks about, I forgot the names of the yeshiva guy and the more secular kid, but, and ideally we should be people who develop based on our exposure to Torah as we get older and extend beyond how we were raised, to genuinely see what our place is within Torah. But you're right that the achdus of the Torah world is a critical thing. It's a critical thing, and that's where Vayichad and other projects like that come from, because Torah should be something that we all rally behind, and that's where the Yisrael Siskodu comes from. It's not just a nice concept. Chazal, we should talk about how when Torah Jews do things in different ways, it implies that there's more than one Torah. Chas v'shalom, more than one God. On the other hand, we have machlokas and we're going to be different. That's why we have the Beis Din HaGadol. That's why we daven a shul. That we can have uniformity in action, even though there'll always be difference in thought. And that's what we're missing, but there'll always be difference in thought. And we have to be able to see that we're all l'shem shamayim and all, rallying behind the Torah. And when we do that as a unified community, then we'll be able to inspire the rest of the Jewish people to join, and then to truly be achdus behind the Torah and Torah values, l'shem shamayim.
For the final question, I want to ask you personally, something that a lot of people think about and struggle with is how far to push themselves, how much to try to take on, when to stop and rest and relax. And you, Taragin, are involved in so many different projects, so many different initiatives. So can you maybe reflect on how you develop your hashkafa with regards to how much to take on, how much to do, and when to take it easy, stop, rest, and relax?
There's really two questions here. One is how hard to work versus relaxation. And the second question is which projects to take on. Let's start with the first question first. This is an excellent example of how Masechet Avot, in its timeless fashion, relates to issues that we have today. If you look at the end of the fourth parak There's two Mishnayos juxtaposed together. The first is recognizing that this world is the pros door, the whole way to the next world. And the next Mishnah talks about, the sha'achas of relaxation in the next world, and the sha'achas of Torah and Maisim Tovim in this world. And when you put those two Mishnayos together, basically what you have is the following. We always need to remind ourselves that we're in the hallway, and there are significant things to do in the hallway, but not to get caught up in the hallway, to realize we're heading into a world that's more significant, greater, more meaningful. So on the one hand, not to get sidetracked by rest, relaxation, and pleasure in our world, because as the second Mishnah says, one moment of Korat Ruach, relaxation, pleasure in the next world is greater than all the pleasure in this world. So why would you sell yourself short? On the other hand, not to think that the pros door is meaningless and we just pass through, we call Hayel Lava, meaning one moment of the ability to do something significant in this world is greater than any significance we can accomplish the next world. Or in other words, the next world is the world of rest, relaxation, and pleasure. This world is the world of growth and meaningful action. That perspective, if you internalize it, it says it all. We have to maximize the moments of this world for growth and meaningful things. Obviously, rest and relaxation are necessary in order for a person to be able to keep functioning well and happily, but it's not the mission, it's not the goal. And we have to remind ourselves of that and seek to try and make the most of the time we're given in this world. So that perspective, I think, if a person keeps it in mind, then it can really help. Another Mishnah that I would add, the famous Mishnayot, to have you been Mahalo, that said in Alvaya, there are two Mishnayos beginning of the second and third Prakim, Rebbe and Akavi ben Mahalil will talk about the things you can look at in order to avoid sin. Yudan Asi says, remind yourself of God's presence and God's watchful eye and ear, etc. But Akavi speaks much more at the existential level. He says, think about where you're coming from, where you're going to, and who you're going to have to give an accounting before. So it's the same thing like the Mishnah about the pros door and the next world, and definitely Pirkei Avos builds a lot on this Olam Hazeh. Think about where you're headed and what you want to bring with you. That kind of, existentialist view of understanding of life can have the biggest impact, and a person should never feel bad about resting or relaxing, assuming they understand that it's a hechsher for something greater and they're doing it accordingly. The question of which projects to be involved in, that's obviously a harder question to answer. But I would give two criteria that I think are helpful. First of all, to see where a person is needed. And a base of a person's life is Talmud Torah. Right? Talmud Torah is a thing we have all the time. We should use our time for all the time. we take off from Talmud Torah for mitzvos, of course, and for other things. And the Gemara in Moed Katan says that, a person takes the Talmud Torah Connected Gum, you'd never do anything else. Right? So we do other things when we're needed, when it can't be done by somebody else, or where it can't be done by somebody else the same way we can do it. So a person has to keep their eyes open and see the opportunities that Hashem brings their way, which become responsibilities, right? Abilities we have, we're meant to respond to, which is responsibility. And the person should realize they're in this world not just to develop themselves, but to make the difference they're expected to make, which is also part of how you develop yourself. And so you should always keep your eyes open to things where you're needed and where you can make a difference, and especially where you're needed to make that difference. And obviously there's different time periods of people's lives. The time where they're focused on their personal growth more, in yeshiva, in times where they're out making an impact more. But halavai, the biggest problem we should have is trying to figure out the balance between our own learning and giving to other people. The first thing going back is to make sure that we're using as much of our time as possible for things that truly matter. It matters to raise children. It matters to build one's home, right? But things that matter as opposed to things that don't.
I think that brings us back to the beginning of this conversation, where the more clarity you have on these questions of hashkafa and how do things fit together in the Torah lifestyle, the more clarity you'll then be able to have when it comes to understanding which projects are meaningful and valuable and which projects are not really worth the time or worth the sacrifice.
Like you said, Rav Tzvi, people very often get caught up on the details, which are, of course, important because ultimately you need to decide between this detail and that detail. But the extent to which a person has clear guidance and direction in life So at least you're in the right direction, which is really, I always tell people are afraid, I'm going to make the wrong decision. And well, Kodesh Baruch Hu can't expect us to make the right decisions, but he definitely can expect us to make decisions for the right reasons. And that's a really critical point. And if you learn Chazal's hashkafa properly, the differences between Jews are going to end up being very small. It could be whether should I draft, I shouldn't draft, meaning that's a big question. But that's a big question within a broader agreed framework. The problems begin when people aren't getting their values from Chazal.
Well, all right, Taragin, you have so much on your plate. We really appreciate, you talked about balancing your time. We really appreciate you decided to take the time to speak to us today. And I'm sure the listeners will really grow a lot from this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'll just add that anyone who wants to get hold of the Sefer, you can get it at RabbiReuvenTaragin.com. And a big issue goes to Tzvi Goldstein, who was the editor of the Sefer.
And a big shout out to my brother-in-law, D. Cedar, who's on the editing team as well, and everyone else who was a part of this very, very important production. The link will be in the show notes, so we can go down there and check it out. And I have my copy right here. Highly, highly recommend it.
As do I.
Keep doing this wonderful podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to Shtark Tank. Coming up next week on our series on Pirkei Avos, we will be talking about loving your job. Is it important to love your job? Is it dangerous to love your job? A reminder that if you want more Shtark Tank content in your life, make sure to join our WhatsApp group. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, keep on Shtarking, Chevra.